So today I am obviously dressed in my Klingon garb, and I wanted to tell a history of the Klingon Empire, both fact and fiction. By that I mean, okay, stuff that went on behind the scenes, and a history of the Klingons in fiction and how they fit into human culture and society. So the name Klingon was actually something Gene Roddenberry had come up with in 1966 when they were first creating the show. There, in fact, was a technician from the LAPD that Gene knew by the name of Klingon. It actually was spelled like with a G or a C or something, but he apparently liked the name, thought it sounded good enough, and he ended up choosing that for one of the alien races on Star Trek. Now, because Star Trek was a low-budget science fiction show in the late 60s, they did not have the budget they needed. In fact, most of the makeup and prosthetic budget went first to Spock's ears. Gene had to actually pay John Chambers, who went on to do the prosthetic work for the Planet of the Apes movies, to come in and make Spock's ears, and also to make the two sets of ears for the Romulans in the episode Balance of Terror, which is why Mark Leonard got recast as Spock's father a year later, because they still had a set of ears that fit him. So that worked out rather well. But when they got towards the end of the season and they were filming the first Klingon episode, Errand of Mercy, they didn't know what to do. Gene wanted the Klingons to have a distinctive alien appearance. He wanted a diverse series of characters throughout the Star Trek universe, including very diverse looking aliens. Well, they didn't have a whole lot to work with, so the best they could come up with was they had some brown and gold face makeup, so they tried to do kind of a burnished skin tone, which on the early RCA televisions only kind of came out as kind of a flat brownish look. If you look at it now in enhanced digital, you could see more of the gold highlights. But back then, that was the best they could do. So, and even later, when they filmed the next two Klingon episodes, The Trouble with Tribbles and Friday's Child, the new makeup team that had been brought in really couldn't get it right. So the face paint looked even flatter than in Errand of Mercy. So it really just didn't work. In fact, the Klingons just weren't all that interesting, except for one episode called Day of the Dove. And in Day of the Dove, we meet the Klingon commander Kang and his wife Mara. It was the first time we'd met a Klingon female. This was done because somebody had written in a fan magazine that Klingons were just made up in factories, that they were just taught to lie and cheat and steal. And it sounded like really weird Cold War propaganda, so Gene wanted to fix that. So he co-wrote this episode in which he showed that Klingons have families, they care about one another, that they're patriots of their empire, they really believe in it, they really care about their people. And that was really good. It gave the first real humanized feel to the Klingons. Fast forward about a decade, and this guy named George Lucas makes a little movie called Star Wars. And it set unbelievable box office records in the late 70s. And suddenly Paramount wanted to get back into the sci-fi game. So they went to Gene Roddenberry and said, hey, there you go. Sorry. They asked him, hey, can we make a Star Trek movie? They knew he had been developing a second Star Trek TV show called Phase 2, which was going to bring back most of the original cast and relaunch the adventures of the Final Frontier. So Gene was like, yes, I can do a Star Trek movie. So they adapted the pilot episode to the new Star Trek series, which was called The Changeling. And in the episode, of course, there was a big, space ship that was coming towards Earth, and it turned out that it was the Voyager 6 probe, and it had been captured by aliens and was sent back to find its creator. And there was a scene with the Klingons, and they threw Gene a huge makeup budget, and Gene was like, hey, I can finally make the Klingons look more interesting. So he sat down with the makeup team and he said, okay, so what can we do? Well, Romulans and Vulcans had the ears, Andorians had the blue skin and the antennae, and one of the makeup artists said, well, what if the Klingons had bumps on their head? And Gene was like, bumps? And he said, okay, so they made up a dummy mask, so just a pullover mask and a prototype of the suit they were going to use. And they dressed Mark Leonard up in it because they decided to cast him as the Klingon captain in the thing, and Gene liked it. And at the time it was like just a uniridge, the whole crew just had the same ridge. Well, you fast forward about 6 years later to Star Trek III, The Search for Spock. And by then, new makeup team, they had some new ideas. They went to Leonard Nimoy, who was directing the film at the time, and they suggested, why don't we make the Klingons have different foreheads, sort of say like they're, fingerprints on humans, except that, it's foreheads. So all the foreheads would look more individualist. Leonard really liked the idea, and they did that. And I think that's a great idea because basically it made Klingons look more diverse, different. You could tell them apart more easily. And that worked out really great, and so that became part of the Klingon lore. Then you go ahead 3 years to 1987 and the release of Star Trek The Next Generation. And once again, Gene was trying to figure out what he should do with the Klingons because he had to do something with them, but he didn't want them just to be bad guys of the week. So luckily, Gene's talented and very beautiful wife, Majel Barrett, stepped up and suggested, why don't you make one of the Klingons a member of the Enterprise crew? And Michael liked that, and that's how, Gene liked that. Obviously, Michael Dorn liked that a whole lot. So they went back and they cast Michael Dorn to play Lieutenant Worf, who was this Klingon bridge officer. And right away, people were very interested. It's like, there's a Klingon. What's the deal here? Did the Klingons join the Federation? What happened here? Well, they weren't entirely sure either. If you go back to the second Q episode, Q says something about the Federation defeating the Klingons. So did that mean the Klingons were beaten in a war by the Federation and were just conquered, or what happened? Well, has Worf's backstory evolved, where he told that he was living on a Klingon colony with his family that was attacked by the Romulans. Hey guys. They then decided that they began to try to write how the episode was going. Bob. So they were trying to figure out how this worked. Well, eventually they decided that the Klingon Empire was still its own thing, but it was an ally to the Federation. And the Federation, of course, is this big conglomerate of all these other races, the humans, the Vulcans, the Andorians, Tellarites, etc. So, but the Klingon Empire still existed on its own. Well, you fast forward to 1991 and a movie called Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country, in which Leonard Nimoy wrote this idea where, what if the Klingon Empire had a kind of a Chernobyl type event? Now, who here remembers Chernobyl? Okay, Chernobyl was a huge nuclear accident that happened in the Soviet Union. And apparently there had been nuclear accidents before, but this was the worst. In fact, Western Europe, Sweden, and a number of other countries could detect it, and Gorbachev was forced to admit that they had had an accident, which just a few years before Mikhail Gorbachev became leader of the Soviet Union was unheard of. So in Star Trek VI, the Klingon moon Praxis blows up and causing massive environmental damage to the Klingon homeworld of Kronos. And so, of course, Kirk and the Enterprise have to start a peace overture with the Klingons in order to help save their planet. And it begins, and of course, this is the basis of the Alliance. In other subsequent episodes of Star Trek The Next Generation, we find out that the Alliance actually got formed because of a series of Romulan attacks on the Klingon outposts that the Federation intervened to save the Klingons. So that's how that alliance evolved. And of course, the Federation continued to get involved in Klingon affairs over the next several years. How I would best describe Klingon culture, though, just to sort of switch topics here, is if you took a group of Vikings and you taught them the samurai art of Bushido, the whole idea of, the art of the sword, the armor, the way of doing things. That's not to say, in a lot of ways it's very accurate, because Vikings, of course, are known for being these great sailors, these great maritime people that, sailed along the coasts of Europe and conquering and stealing stuff, but also leaving their mark. There's any number of Irish names now that are traced back to the Vikings. The Japanese also had a great maritime history for a short time during the Middle Ages, when European sailors first came to Japan and they saw these big ships and they learned how to make them, and they began sailing around the Pacific. But during the latter half of the Tokugawa shogunate, the Japanese were forced to destroy the ships and became more xenophobic, and like the Klingons, their government became a lot more corrupt until the mid-19th century, when the emperor finally took control again of Japan. Sort of like what happened later in Star Trek, when the Emperor Kahless returned as a clone and became this spiritual guide for the rest of the Empire to sort of restore Klingon traditional values of honor. So speaking about Kahless for a minute, the first time we ever see Kahless is in an episode of the original series called The Savage Curtain, and of course Kahless did not have one of these. So we had to make do with, of course, the old makeup. So what later writers have just said was that the alien that was creating all these representations of Lincoln and Serac just took the image of what Kirk thought of what a Klingon looked like from his own mind. And what the type of Klingons Kirk was most used to were the flat-headed Klingons. So he just made Kahless look like one of the Klingons he would have encountered. Obviously, that was not the case of what the Klingons actually thought he looked like. The Klingons actually started developing space travel some 500 years before humans did, after they had been conquered for a time by a race they called the Hurg. They never really actually knew their name, but the Klingons fought back and they learned the technology of this race, and eventually learned how to build their own ships and weapons. And one of the first places they went to was a planet called Boroth, which was located around a star that Kahless told them to come look for him. Now, obviously he wasn't there, but they built a temple for him, waiting for him to return. And of course he did later return as a clone and became basically the spiritual guide for the Klingon Empire. But as the Klingon Empire developed more space technology and began encountering other races, all in attempts to try to find the Hurg and try to finish them off, and also to get back several artifacts, including the Sword of Kahless, they began to encounter these other races, and in some cases either conquered them or traded with them. And they eventually began to develop greater amounts of technology and science and other things. During this time, the military began to take a greater control of Klingon affairs, of the Klingon government and social order, whereas it used to be more equal, that there were artists and poets and lawyers and farmers and warriors who were all treated with respect, and suddenly it was the warriors who suddenly began being the face of the Klingon Empire and taking more control over things. And this is how it was until the late 23rd century, when Praxis blew up. So I'm going to open the floor up to questions. Anyone? If you ask questions, you get more chocolate. Okay. Yep. I'll just give you another one. Yeah, Bob.
Forgive me, I came in late. Did you cover record this, don't worry.
Yeah.
What you're talking about, how much of it is from canon and how much of it is from...
Pretty much it's all from canon. The stuff about the Herg, that came from the episode. Yeah, that was from the Deep Space Nine episode, The Sword of Kahless. That was John Calicos returned as Core the second time and joined with Worf and Jadzia to go into the the Gamma Quadrant, because he believed he had found evidence that the Herg had come from somewhere in the Gamma Quadrant, and that he might be able to find the Sword of Kahless there.
Okay.
So, and of course, it kind of led to a dispute between him and Worf. Apparently, there was something about the sword that had a negative influence on both of them. And so Jadzia decided that it was best to beam the sword out into space until a time when the Klingons were ready to take it back for some reason. They didn't really go into that part of the episode, whether that was some sort of booby trap or there was just something about the sword that just brought out something crazy in both Core and Worf. But that was kind of what happened there. Interesting side note, John Calicos finished his final episode as Core about a week before he passed away on Deep Space Nine in season 7. His last scene, of course, is him stepping onto the Klingon transporter pad to beam over to take over another bird of prey. He says, "Long live the Empire," and it's just kind of like, considering the fact that he was so identified, even over his character on Battlestar Galactica, that Core was a character he was more identified with. So it was really kind of very fitting, since he was so well known for that character. He literally, people would ask him so much about that character over the years. That or Baltar were the two characters he got asked the most about. And it was a part he had really enjoyed over the years. He talked about in interviews about playing it. He was actually supposed to be a recurring villain on the original Star Trek, but because of filming schedules for other projects he was involved in, he could only play Core the one time in the episode Errand of Mercy. So that was kind of what happened there. That's how we end up with other characters like Koloff and Kang and other Klingons. So I know there's a lot of controversy recently about the Discovery Klingons. And I just want to say about them, I really like Discovery. I think it's a great show. I am really confused by this new look. I've heard a lot of people say that, they're just a third version of Klingons, and that the other Klingons still exist. Okay, well, I guess I've heard rumors that in the next season or so that the other Klingons will come back. I don't really know where these guys came from, other than Brian Fuller wanted to reimagine them in a different way. Some fans really are not into them. I kind of go back and forth. I think they've been good characters. I think overall the first season of Discovery was great. I really enjoyed it. And I really hope more people will give it an opportunity as time goes on. But I think, and I've been saying this a lot this weekend, I think that now that the two head writers who apparently were really difficult to get along with, well, that was an understatement. Apparently in one instance, some of them actually climbed over a table and started screaming at the writers. I was like, yeah, I could see where that's a problem. So CBS, yes, sir.
You've given us the real-world explanation for this.
Oops. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
I'll get it. I got it.
Okay, you got to think.
Give us the real-world explanation for the smooth forehead on the original series.
Yeah.
Klingons. Has there been an in-series explanation?
Yes, there was. I'm glad you brought that up. Okay. This was actually covered in the final season of Enterprise.
Okay.
A lot of fans have been wanting to know for 25 years, why did the Klingons look different from the original show, from the movies and the Next Generation? Well, the real reason, of course, was low budget. Gene couldn't afford it. But for years, a lot of fans put up all kinds of reasons. First, there was the Trouble with Tribbles one where, maybe the Klingons had surgically altered a whole bunch of Klingons to make them look more human and make it easier to infiltrate the Federation. Well, that didn't make a lot of sense, because that would have been a huge use of resources. And given that we know the Klingons were supposed to be resource poor, that didn't seem like it was a good use. Chris Claremont, who was best known for writing the X-Men comic books, wrote a Star Trek miniseries for DC, in which he explained that he thought that there were two major ethnic groups in the Klingon Empire, the Flatheads and the Ridgeheads, and that the Flatheads were all discommoded out of and banished from the Empire. That's why we never saw them again. Of course, that was sort of thrown out the window when Kang, Kor, and Koloff started showing up on Deep Space Nine. So the real reason, or the actual reason they gave on the show, was in season 4 of Enterprise, these Klingons had gotten a hold of some augmented human DNA. By augmented, I meant like Khan. Apparently, Data's great-grandfather had been a geneticist, and he was trying to revive the eugenics programs of the late 20th century that resulted in the creation of Khan and other people like him. And these new augmented humans attacked and captured a Klingon ship. So the Klingons thought that the humans were trying to create stronger and smarter humans, and they thought they were about to go into a genetic Cold War. So they started trying to develop smarter and stronger Klingons. And they injected this group of Klingons with some of this augmented human DNA in the hopes that would work. Well, the result was it made their heads flatter. It did increase their IQs. It didn't make them that much stronger. But one of the Klingons had been exposed to a very, very contagious disease. And what happened was the disease got mutated as well, and it spread quickly throughout this colony. And because the Klingons are a spacefaring race, it quickly spread to several other planets within the Klingon Empire, causing this deformity. It was only because Captain Archer and Dr. Phlox were able to come up with a way to save them that it stabilized the disease before it killed millions of Klingons. But it did leave almost half of the Empire, with this deformity for at least a century. It wasn't until the late 2260s that the virus was isolated and genetic therapy was able to restore the Klingons to their natural appearance. So that's how that was basically fixed. So, next question. Yes?
Tie into why B'Elanna looks the way she does, or she's genetically altered?
Sorry, say that again?
B'Elanna.
B'Elanna is half human. Her father was human. Her mother was a Klingon. They were apparently living on the same colony. They were married for a while. But apparently the marriage didn't work out, and B'Elanna's mother decided to return to the Klingon Empire, and B'Elanna was just kind of left on her own. She tried to join Starfleet for a time, but that didn't work, and eventually she ended up in the Maquis, and then, of course, joined the crew of Voyager. So that was kind of why she kind of, had more faded ridges compared to, say, Worf's. Next question. Anyone? Okay, well, I wanted to say something else about the ridges. I love the fact that they did make them more individualized, because if you really look at the ridges, they almost sort of seem to tell a story. Okay, Worf's ridges look obviously more straight and noble looking, this guy's heroic, a brave soul. Whereas the Doris family all seem to kind of have this like horns, like they were demonic somehow. Kempex, if you remember Kempex, the Chancellor of the Klingon Empire from the episode Sins of the Father, I was looking at his forehead ridge, and I'm sorry we didn't get to do the slideshow because I wanted to show this. I swear his forehead looked like a tire track, like people have been walking on this guy for years. Like he was just tired out. And Gowron, though, I really loved his forehead, because you always thought there was something crazy about that guy, and his forehead just looked completely mashed up, like he'd had some I don't know, he played a whole lot of football and got hit on his head a lot, and it just kind of looked like, yeah, this forehead's telling you this guy is not right in the head, literally. And if you saw his last few episodes of Deep Space Nine, you'd probably agree with that. So, okay, so we got any more questions? Anybody will learn it? Yes, Brent.
You're wearing something around your neck.
Yes, this was part of my costume. I forgot to put this on earlier. This is some part that was supposed to fit in here, and I forgot to put it on. I was like, I'm not taking all this stuff. Just threw this on there.
What does it do?
It's just like a command rank insignia.
Okay.
It really doesn't have much purpose. I mean, there's a lot of things they put on Klingon armor that I'm not really sure what they do, but
Well, they look nice.
yeah, they do look great. I love the Klingon armor. Going back for a second about the whole idea of Klingons as samurai. If you look at their armor and you look at samurai armor, they look very similar, don't you think? That they kind of, the sort of layout, the shoulder pads and the whole, sewn together armor, like that's kind of padded. Japanese samurai traditionally wore leather armor with either bamboo or pieces of steel sort of sewn into these things. And that's kind of the impression I get with the Klingons. Even the words, like the word for Klingon warrior, which is suvi, is sort of similar to the word samurai, which basically means one who serves. Suvi literally means one who fights. But technically, samurai could mean anyone who serves. Your waiter could be a samurai. The person who's washing the car could be a samurai. It's more in modern literature with a lot of immigration and from Japan in the early 20th century that we began to sort of associate the word samurai with the guys carrying the swords and doing all the fighting and stuff. So I just thought since the words were so similar, and next time I meet Mark Oakwood, I'm going to ask him, did he really think that there was just a coincidence that, sous-vide is similar to the word samurai in that both the way it sounds and just what the words mean. So we got any more questions? Anything? Anyone? Yes.
I'm trying to remember what it was. There was something about the Klingon spine and nervous system.
Yeah.
That came into play the one time that
Mhm.
was seriously injured.
Yeah.
And I don't remember what it was that was supposed to be so different.
Klingons have a double spinal cord and a double rib cage, the exo and an endo. We also have 8-chambered hearts. We don't have 2 hearts, it's an 8-chambered heart. We do have 2 livers and 3 stomachs. One's for the food, one's for the wine, and one's for the blood of our enemies. Sorry, I just heard that somewhere. I thought that was awesome. Yeah, but the Crusher and the doctor that were going to be operating on Worf to try to repair his spine, they basically thought, okay, there's all these redundancies. Like, okay, if one thing fails, they got another one. They got a spare part in there. It just seems like to them so many things would go wrong, but to the Klingons, it just makes sense. That's just the way they are, and that's what makes Klingons so durable, that they can keep fighting and endure the harshest climates because they have all these extra organs. There was one really great picture somebody had done, and I really wanted to show you guys this, that somebody had done an anatomical drawing of the inside of a Klingon, of what the inside, based on that episode, a Klingon's anatomy would look like. And I thought, wow, that would be really cool to show off. So, but I was unable to do the slideshow. So hopefully next year we will, if I can do this again. So, so we got any more questions?
Do 3 stomachs have to do anything? A lot of what the Klingons eat,
Mm-hmm.
particularly the meat, raw and or alive.
Yeah.
So would any of the stomachs help with the
Yeah,
digestion?
I would think they would, because I mean, you're just, if all 3 stomachs work like a human stomach, they just kind of go through continuing to process and break down everything, the ga, the Pepius claw. Certainly most historians and archaeologists have determined that the human appendix was used to actually help humans digest like harsher foods, but is no longer needed and is now just sort of become like this thing that hangs off your intestine and sometimes becomes infected. But in the Klingon sense, I don't think diet has really changed that much in the last 2,000, 10,000 years of Klingon history. Klingons basically base their whole diet on the idea that, okay, they're foragers and hunter-gatherers. so they have to eat things kind of on the go. So sometimes they didn't always cook their food. They just kind of had to eat it, you know. They found a dead animal, you just eat it. I know that sounds kind of gross, but you know, it's Klingon.
And the name of the primary planet changed. At one time, they were actually calling it Kling, and then Klingon Prime, and then finally
Kronos. Okay. The previous names that we heard before Kronos are not actually canon. Okay. They really had trouble coming up with a name for the Klingon home world. For a long time, it was just called the home world. It was one of those things Roddenberry just couldn't, you know, they gave him a lot of suggestions, he just didn't really like them. So in Star Trek VI, Leonard Nimoy and Nick Meyer decided, okay, we need to have a name for this planet. So they decided to go with Kronos, which sounds like the name of the Greek Titan, who's the father of Zeus and Hades. But literally the way it's pronounced in actual Klingon, it's Kronos. But human ears and Vulcan ears tend to hear the word Kronos. Sort of like with Klingon, everybody hears Klingon, they hear it with a K, but it's actually pronounced Klingon, which is actually with a TL and an H. So it's Klingon. Really, I'm not kidding. That's how it is. That is in the books, and so that's how they pronounce it. Mark Okran basically said that was, because when he went through and started rewriting the language, the way the Klingon language evolved was, first Jimmy Doohan had come up with some words in Klingon for Star Trek: The Motion Picture, because Gene wanted the Klingons to have their own language. It had been referred to in episodes like The Trouble with Tribbles that there was this language called Klingonese, but we'd never heard it. So we heard it in the first Star Trek movie. Well, a couple years later, when Mark Okran came in as a language consultant for Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, he met Leonard Nimoy because he had to make up some lines in Vulcan for him and Saavik to speak back and forth to each other. And when Leonard was going to film Star Trek III: The Search for Spock, he wanted to have a bunch more Klingon dialogue. Of course, they didn't have a Klingon dictionary then. So he invited Mark to come back and help him develop a Klingon language. And Mark took some of the stuff that Jimmy Doohan had initially developed, and he sort of built on that. And he came up with a lot of stuff like, for example, Klingon names don't start with a capital letter. They all start with lowercase letters, which is not uncommon to other languages. That's just more of an English-centric thing. And of course, making it sort of guttural and coming up with all kinds of syntax and phrases. And basically, he just made Klingon a very complicated and realistic language. In fact, there are a lot of online courses that you can take if you're interested in learning how to say something in Klingon. Or, I do know that these are still available in the dealer's room if anybody's interested. But that was kind of but then it was years later. It wasn't until Star Trek VI that they finally they came up with the name Kronos. And Mark Okran, I do know, suggested a name for the episode Sins of the Father, but Gene still didn't like that one. So Kronos is just the name they came up with, and it's stuck ever since for the last 20-some years, so, which is okay. I think that's a good name for the planet. So, more questions? Yeah, Shalini.
So has the language changed over the various series, or is it still, they're still sticking with?
Actually, yes, it has changed a little bit. The Klingon language does not express future tenses. So in Star Trek VI, Nick Meyer went to Mark Okran and said, hey, I need to come up with a phrase in Klingon. And Mark said, okay, what do you need to say? I need to have to be or not to be. And Mark Okran was like, you're kidding me. Because there is not supposed to be a to be in the Klingon phrase. So there's also no I will, she will, he will. There's no ambiguous future thing. You know, everything is very specific. Like if you say, you don't say, I will go to Hunt Valley. You're going to say, tomorrow at 8 a.m., I drive to Hunt Valley. It's more specific than that. I used to think that was kind of weird, but then I thought, well, if you're a military culture and you tend to plan things out, you're probably going to go into more detail. So that makes sense with Klingons, that you're more specific about what's going to happen in the future rather than being ambiguous, because Klingons do not like ambiguity at all. That irritates us terribly. Yes, sir, you had a question.
Yes. How did Klingon Empire and the Klingons go from proxy Soviets, thank you, to what they became?
Like Samurai Vulcans.
Yeah.
Samurai Vikings, right? Sorry. That was just the writers. Yeah, gotcha. 5 minutes. Thank you. That was just the writers. You were dealing with a lot of writers who were more used to writing shows like Mission Impossible or spy thrillers and stuff like that. And they basically thought of the Klingons in terms of like, okay, you know, they're the Cold War enemies of the Federation, so let's write them like we would an episode of Man from U.N.C.L.E. or Mission Impossible, that sort of thing, where they would sort of be more like those kind of characters. But Roddenberry was obviously never happy with that, and he decided he really wanted to make them more interesting. So, as with like the Vulcans and the Romulans, he developed this, you know, he came up with this idea of the culture of Klingons that really we saw more of in the Next Generation. In a lot of ways, Worf is really an interesting character because, you know, he is a guy that is a Klingon, but he wasn't raised amongst other Klingons, but he has these high moral beliefs of what a Klingon should act like. And this is what he thinks they should, but he's been removed from the culture most of his life, but he chooses to try to be this ideal. So, but when he finally meets other Klingons, it's like, this is not the way we ought to act. I think we should act more like the way Kalis told us to. And more of them like, no, just any way that, you know, gets us to victory is fine. And, you know, Worf is obviously never comfortable with that because, you know, he's been willing to, you know, allow them to banish him from the Empire because he knows in his heart he's right, that this is not the way we should do things. And in the end, he's been proven correct. Of course he is. He's the good guy. He's the hero of this. So, but okay. So we're probably going to be kicked out of here very shortly. Anybody else got any other questions? Or would anybody just like more chocolate?
Bring your targ.
No. They won't believe me when I say he's a service targ. You know, I know. It's just so irritating.
That counts as a chocolate question.
Yes, that does count. You are right, Bob. Yes, a chocolate question. Yes. All good questions get chocolate. So anybody else would just like some more chocolate before you go? Or oh, wait, you came in here late. Do you have any questions about Klingons?
Probably too many, that's the problem.
Well, just give me one real quick.
Are the newer Klingons have less wrinkles?
Do the newer Klingons?
Klingons have less wrinkles on the farm. They
Ridge.
look different now.
Yes, they do.
They do.
Yeah, you mean on Discovery?
Yeah.
Yeah, they look very radically different. That was just more of a decision by Brian Fuller. We so far have not come up with a explanation that makes them fit into the established continuity of any of the other Star Trek shows.
So there's no plan to show the relationship?
I keep hearing a rumor. Yeah, we're done. I keep hearing rumors, but you know, I mean, we will see. You know, we will see what happens. So, but anyway, thank you all for coming today. I am also once again featured in the anthology Brave New Girls Volume 3, Girls Who Hack and Scheme. They are on sale down at Writers Row, and I and Mary Fan will be happy to sign you copies this weekend. So thank you all very much. Kabla!